Okay, hello everybody. We are live now. Welcome to Why Read episode 19. And here on my channel today, I actually have two returning guests because I've had both of these lovely ladies on my channel in the past. So, starting off from my right, we have Laura from Fantasy Awash, and she was recently on my channel for the Lions of Alrasan discussion that we had.
Yes.
So, hi Laura, how are you
Hi,
doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
Happy to have you. And then also returning is Jack from Jack in the Book Stack. And so Jack was actually on my channel for my first um, guest discussion panel of A Game of Thrones,
Oh,
which was
cool.
really interesting to hear Jack's thoughts on that particular book. And we were also on Mike's book reviews live stream together for his Saturday night nights. So, and we're good friends. We actually really enjoy watching each other's videos. I enjoy Jack's channel because she reads a lot of genres that I don't read, but she does such a great job of getting me interested in the books she's talking about. So, hello, Jack. How are you?
Hello. I'm good. Thanks for having me back. I'm glad you haven't canceled me after the Game of Thrones discussion.
No.
Did something happen that was
No,
contentious?
I don't get it so far.
Really?
Yeah, and so
Okay.
I was my big thing was I'm like, are you guys sure this is fantasy? I don't understand. Where's the magic?
The
So
first book is like that.
Yeah.
Then it really
Very low
gets
fantasy.
magical the more you get into the series. Like where I'm at, I'm rereading book 5 right now, and I'm like, there's so much magic all over the
Yeah.
oh,
place.
good.
Yeah.
It's definitely a high fantasy story with low magic.
I
That's
wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say it's low
really
magic.
in the
Mm-mm.
first book, in the
Just
first
the
book,
first
low
book,
magic.
yeah.
Yeah. And then it
But it's
definitely picks
it's
up.
there, and you even get it in the prologue. Like, you
Yes.
get
But it's
magic in the prologue, and that's hinting
yeah.
there's a lot more here in this world than what meets the surface, but
Definitely.
yeah, I love it. Anyway, sorry, we're cheating. I cheated because I asked, "Well, how are you?" And actually, and thank you everybody who's in the chat. Really glad to see you all here. Thank you so much for joining us today. And but I haven't asked the why read question yet. So why read is a discussion series where we always start with that question, and the why read question is less a reading origin story kind of question, like what made you fall in love with reading to begin with. We can go down that route later, but this is really about right now, like right now in your life. What is calling you to pick up a book when there are so many other things competing for your attention, whether it's Netflix or TikTok for some people, I guess, or other things that call our attention. So what makes you want to pick up a book? And Laura, let's start with you.
For me, it's because I had a really bad traumatic brain injury and wasn't able to read for a very long time, and only really started being able to read again last December. So that for me has been my motivator because I've missed several years. So I'm trying to play catch up as much as I can and really value where I'm putting my time with that, because I missed out on it for a really long time. So right now, that's definitely my motivator.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. That's an amazing story there. What does it felt like to get into reading, especially with the channel?
It's been good. It's been motivating. I've always been a big reader, except for this time that I couldn't be. So it's been really nice to reignite a love that it's a lost love, basically, that I'm getting to re-explore what that relationship is like. So that's been really wonderful. It's also important to me because I have a daughter now, and I want her to grow up seeing that her parents read, because I want to share that love of reading desperately.
Yeah.
But having the channel has really kept me focused. I set a goal for myself last year, when I started. Well, I technically started this year, but I thought about it last year, that I needed to make a video every week for a year. So, and see how I felt at the end of the year and kind of go with that. And initially, when I set out, my goal was that I was going to read 12 books for the year. And I ended up reading 12 books by March. So I was like, okay, this is going really, really well. So it's just been really, really nice to have that interest and passion again. It's been great.
Oh, that's so inspiring, Laura. And I didn't know that about your story. I didn't know that. That's beautiful. And I think 12 books by March or 12 books in a year is a worthwhile goal for any person too.
Honestly, number really doesn't matter. And I think it was Bookborn that did the video on this, and it resonated very deeply. It's not the quantity of what you read, but rather the quality of what you read and how you relate to that material. So yeah, having a goal number is fine. If that's what motivates you and drives you, go for it. Absolutely. But it's just been really nice to get so much quality content of what I'm reading, because I haven't been able to do it for the last few years. I'm playing catch up on all these really great series and authors that I haven't read before. So that's been really, really fun.
Yeah, so that's exactly why I created the Why Read series, because I decided that was my biggest inspiration. Part of the inspiration of creating this whole series is that I know that BookTube can be a bit performative, and like, not to say that's a bad thing totally. I think that there's a lot of value in that still, and that's a whole discussion there. But I think a lot of BookTube content focuses on the it focuses on the numbers game. How many books you read in a month and what you're reading. And it's about that numeric goal, the Goodreads goal, all types of statistics. And I think there's value in that. I'm not trying to say I'm standing against that. However, I've always been somebody who's drawn more towards the qualitative type of experience rather than just numbers and quantitative experiences. And I wanted to bring voice to that qualitative part, and both can exist together. That's what I believe. So that's actually been one of my reasons for creating this series, because while BookTube is driven by how much I read and what I read, I'm like, but why? What's the driving force? What's within you that's calling you to read? Because sometimes we are, even on BookTube, and I am too, called towards, ooh, shiny object over there. I want to read that. But what is it in you that is
100%.
what in you is pulling you towards that experience? So I love that story, Laura. Thank you for sharing that. And what about you, Jack? Why do you read? What's inspiring you to read these days?
Nothing that can compare to Laura's inspirational story. I'm like, oh, I'm not meant
to be like on a podium box here. I
feel so shallow now. Oh man. I mean, it's basic escapism, and it to enhance whatever mood I'm in, what I'm looking for. Sometimes work and real life can be so stressful. I just need an escape from tension. So I go to read because I just want to release the tension in my shoulders. I want to laugh. I want to feel warm and cozy. Or if, I'm feeling I want something more intelligent and political and, lots of plot twists. I want to be entertained in that way. I want more excitement. Maybe I'm feeling restless. That might be why I pick up a book. It definitely comes from the mood and what I'm looking for in that moment. But generally, I'm always chasing that high of finding the book that you just sink into, where the world just dissolves around you. And it's almost like a dreamlike state, because when you close the book for a second, you're still kind of in that world. And it's not hallucinations, but it kind of feels that way. It kind of feels like a book hangover, because you're still in that character's mind or feeling what they're feeling, and it carries over to your real life. So I'm always chasing that reading goal. I love that.
Yeah. So. Oh, that's so beautifully said. And I especially love the way you started that about like relaxing the shoulders and sinking into a world that reading can be. It could be a beautiful escape. It could be one that's actually good for our system, good for our minds. I think that is a beautiful way to describe it, because I think that a lot of times, a lot of us, and I know, like I said, this why read question, it goes into a little more specifically, like, why right now are you propelled to pick up a book? But I think a lot of us, from what I gather, especially watching Philip's discussion series, the DDF, Dear Dr. Fantasy, where he does ask people about their fantasy origin story and how they get into reading. It seems like from watching that discussion series, a lot of people do pick up books because they fall in love with reading when they're young, like when they're either young children or when they are in middle school or high school, is when they have that discovery experience of like, I could just the world can dissolve into this book. This is the most magical, incredible experience. And then it seems like as we get a little older, maybe because there is so much pressure, especially on young adults, to figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life and be part of the real world, that maybe that's what causes many of us not to pick up as much fiction for a while. I know some people have been consistent fiction readers even throughout their adolescence and early adult years, but a lot of people haven't. And I wonder if, that could take the weight of the world on your shoulders. It could just be so heavy sometimes. And it's kind of scary to relax when you feel like you have to be on top of things all the time. And so to come back to realize, hey, it's okay to relax. It's okay to escape is kind of like a beautiful message, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always different purposes, right? Because a lot of times I want to see a good guy win, or, like I want to cheer for someone and have them win, because being an adult sucks sometimes, right? Like you just want to see someone winning and you want to root for someone. It's kind of like the same thing as having like a sports team that you cheer for, right? Like you want to root for someone and have them win, and you go through the trials and tribulations with them. So yeah, it's a good escapism for adulthood.
Oh, that's a really good point. I never thought about the winning losing paradigm, because I don't know that we really have that. I guess some people might think of politics in that way, but for those of us who most in the modern age watching politics, I don't think it feels that way. It just feels like, this is just bad news all the time. Who's really winning here? Whereas, like, you're right, there's something about that experience of feeling like you're in a situation and you're rooting for somebody and you're going on that experience with them. Yeah. Now, Laura, that makes me think of a wonderful video essay that you did on your channel. You talked about portal fantasy, and you talked a lot about the hero's journey. Actually, you've talked about the hero's journey in a few different videos.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate
for
on
a
that?
hero's journey trope.
Yeah.
I love it, but I mean, the origins of the hero's journey are thousands upon thousands of years old. So I think it's proven that time and time again, we as humanity return to that type of narrative because we do want what JAK is saying. We want to see someone persevere. And if we look at myth, and particularly Greek myth, you can see it, but there's always a caveat of something bad will probably also happen. So it's not always everything turns out hunky-dory at the end and it's a happy ending. There's a happy ending plus, so I think as humans, we understand that we are nuanced and we like nuanced stories. So the hero's journey is one that within fantasy, outside of fantasy, it's something that people return to over and over because people often like to see a good guy win.
Yeah, that's neat. And so speaking of fantasy specifically, because I know, JAK, you read a lot of different genres. Do you too have a specific fantasy genre that's your favorite? Because it sounds to me like, Laura, from what you're saying, you talked about portal fantasy quite a bit, and you talked about the hero's journey. Would you say that portal fantasy in particular is maybe your favorite type of fantasy subgenre?
No, it's grimdark.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I love grimdark.
The good guys don't always win in grimdark, though.
No, but see, that's the thing.
Yeah,
I can deal with it. It depends on the type of story I'm reading. Like if you pick up Harry Potter, right? You're like, okay, in the end that he's likely gonna win, and because that's the kind of story you're gearing up for. I like really gritty characters in my stories, which is why First Law is one of my absolute favorites. I love A Song of Ice and Fire. I like characters that I can point to in a story and say, I hate that person.
Wow.
Or I love that person in the same story, because I think it takes such a complex author to make me feel such extreme emotions regarding characters in the same narrative. So I love that. And I also find that the more I'm reading, I find that grimdark tends to have magic, but it's not at the forefront of the story a lot of the same ways in other genres of fantasy or subgenres of fantasy. And the more and more I'm reading, I'm realizing that while I like magic at certain times, I'm definitely leaning more towards low magic systems in the stories that I read and have more character-driven plots. And I feel like grimdark tends to be that. So yeah, it's probably grimdark.
Wow. So, that's fascinating. I did not expect that answer from you, Laura. I know that sounds crazy because I feel like, I don't know. It's funny because when I was watching a recent video on your channel where you're talking about books I can't stop talking about, or
Yeah.
the books that you love, which I recommend people check out that video because you did a beautiful job just describing why you love each of the books why they were all so meaningful to you.
Mhm.
But I would have not expected grimdark to be, especially based on that video, to be your
Yeah,
number
I
one
mean,
favorite genre.
I tend to love most of the fantasy genre. Romance is definitely the one that I don't lean into. If it's in a YA story, I go in expecting that trope is going to be there, or like certain Sanderson stories. I'm like, okay, there's probably going to be a love thing here that I'm probably not really going to like, but I'll get through it. That's fine. But I'll read anything as long as it seems appealing and interesting to me. But the stories that I find, especially with my husband, that I return to over and over to talk about are the grimdark stories. And it's because he and we both love those morally gray characters. And it's a genre too that he and I both read. So it's fun to have that back and forth with your partner. So I think that probably plays into a little bit of it as well.
Wow. That's a really interesting point that we can go off it a little bit, just the connection that you have. You said that with your husband, there is something when you're able to talk about something that I think
Yeah.
gives you a sign, okay, that might be something that you're drawn towards. But Jack, what about you? Because you read a lot of
Oh my
genres.
gosh.
And when
I
it
have
comes
like
to,
my
I'll
mind's
just narrowing it
reeling.
down to fantasy though. Like
I know. I have so many different things running through my mind right now. I was thinking about what Laura just said about, the bad guy and pointing to the bad guy. And my mind goes to like dark romance. And I'm like, I like a bad guy too, in a very different kind of way when I read dark romance. And then grimdark, I have a lot of thoughts on that we can go off on. And I definitely want some recommendations for female grimdark authors. So
yes.
We'll come back to that. But for fantasy and what I gravitate towards right now, I'm just so excited that I know what you guys are talking about. And, starting my fantasy journey last year is the first time I really started reading fantasy.
Wow.
And I think the reason I started was largely because of people like you reading fantasy books, doing videos on it, because the perception I had is that it was always very male dominated. Mm-hmm. And very violent, just for the sake of violence. Like there doesn't have to be a story or depth or characters. It's just blood and guts. Like that was the impression I always had. And it's kind of, being on BookTube and seeing people's reviews on it and dissecting it, and then seeing women get involved in reading fantasy. I'm like, oh, this is more approachable than I thought. And so that's how I started. And I'm just so happy. I know what you guys are talking about by Grimdark and First Law trilogy. So I'm still new in my journey, finding these different subtropes of fantasy to find what I like. I don't know if I can jump on board with the grimdark yet. I'm surprised.
We'll be happy to welcome you if you do.
I'm surprised how much I enjoy it more than I thought I would. I thought it would be violence for shock value, and that's not the case. I do like cozy if I'm looking for an escape. I think that's been a very comforting subgenre for me this year that's really worked. I'm in the middle of doing a reading vlog, seeing if I can enjoy YA fantasy, because I'm in my mid-30s. Like, I cannot relate to these like teenagers, but I'm shocked how much I'm enjoying my experience in YA fantasy. I'm like, all these preconceived notions I had about fantasy are being blown out of the water. So it's so hard for me to answer. I think I agree. I like romance as a subplot a little bit more rather than at the forefront, because if the world is ending, you should probably put your hormones in check. Like bigger picture.
That's the number one complaint I hear about YA these days. Yeah.
So I don't really have an answer of a favorite of a subgenre yet. I'm like trying a little bit of magical realism, which, Laura, that seems like kind of on board with what you were saying, like lighter magic kind of in the background. I'm just shocked how much I'm enjoying all across fantasy when I never expected I'd like it as much as I do.
So you said something that I thought was so interesting, how like for women, approaching fantasy might be a bit more daunting. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, the first fantasy book for me was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I feel like, and of course, this is a portal fantasy, right? So that's like where the root of my love of portal fantasy comes from. But the protagonist is a female character in that book. So for me, I just assumed like all fantasy was written for women. Growing up, I was like, well, it's welcome to women because we have all these female protagonists within fantasy. So I find that so interesting because fantasy has been my preferred genre since I was in the 5th grade. And I love that you feel that as a woman, you can approach fantasy and that it's a welcoming place for women. Because I'm like, yes, it is, guys. Like, get on board.
But you're right about those. You're absolutely right at the same time. But I wanted quickly to say, I'm glad that Polly brought this up because Jack, I think I've recommended to you a few times. And I think because you're getting into YA fantasy, I would highly recommend Arden's trilogy, the Winter Night trilogy. I think I've mentioned it to you before. That's the Bear and the Nightingale.
Yes, I read that one.
Did you read
the first one? Yeah, I read the first one.
Okay, you didn't continue.
Not yet. But I liked it. It kind of has a take on. It felt like a fairy tale almost.
It's it's based on Russian folklore.
Yeah. But I like that subgenre as well. It's like everything I'm liking more than I expected. So
I think I thought books 2 and 3 got even better for me personally. I know some people have some mixed feelings about that trilogy. Yeah. But Evie, my friend Evie from She Was Only Evie, who might pop into the chat later, I'm not sure. She gets mad at me because I have called it, I think it leans a little YA. And she gets mad at me. She says, no, it's adult.
I think it's YA.
Why do you think it's YA though? Because that's an interesting question.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. Yeah.
I think the way it's written comes across as more YA. So my general take, and I mean, there's certain examples. I feel like Mistborn is typically the one that people talk about, that it kind of walks that fine line, that it could be categorized as adult versus YA. But I think really what it comes down to is the simplicity of prose that typically my brain associates with YA versus adult and fantasy. And of course, there's particular tropes that tend to be more attributable to each class of fantasy. But with this one specifically, I found the prose was very akin to a lot of other YA that I had read. And that there's nothing wrong with that. I enjoy a YA novel every once in a while. So that was just my impression. I thought it was a YA book, but I guess it's not.
I honestly think Catherine Arden's prose is beautiful.
It is.
It is so gorgeous. It's so well done. I like it because it has a lot of tone to it.
Yes.
And I feel like a lot of modern fantasy. And I think that's what adds to the whimsy of the world and the magic that she's creating. So I love her prose. I think it's beautiful, actually. But I do agree with you. At the same time, this is where it gets challenging. Because like, what would you say then about Stormlight Archive? Because a lot of people argue that the prose is very, very simple.
It is.
Well, and that's, you can't say just because it's simple. It's so hard. And this is something I'm working through in the vlog I'm filming now. But there's always a counter argument for when you're trying to define YA, because just because the prose is simple doesn't mean the target audience is like a 14, 15-year-old.
No.
Just because the characters are in their teens doesn't mean the book is targeted for teens, right? It's really hard. And then when you get into spice level, the conversation gets really complex because, teens are like balls of raging hormones. So that's what they relate to, what they want to read about. But then like, what's too spicy? Like, where is the line here? And so I really don't know how to define YA. And it's another one of those preconceived notions I had in the fantasy world. Like, I'm in my mid-30s. Like, I shouldn't be reading YA, but I'm finding myself so intrigued when I read a synopsis of these books, and I'm shocked. I think the big thing I don't like in YA is when authors try too hard to relate to kids by saying like grown-ups just don't understand. Like, I get that's a common thing that kids feel, but not everybody does all the time.
No.
Like, you can have good adults with relationships represented in books. It seems like a cheap shot to me. But yeah, I don't know how to define it, because if the prose is simple, that could appeal to anybody.
It's really a tricky question, in my opinion. And I just also want to bring up, Polly keeps on bringing up the recommendations. Juliette Marillier. I haven't read Daughter of the Forest, but I keep hearing
I've heard really good
so much
things.
praise for that first book. I've heard mixed things for the rest of the trilogy. But it's, and I know there's a new adult category. Absolutely. So I read earlier this year, Mercedes Lackey's, I always forget. Oh, the Arrows trilogy. I always forget the name of the trilogy. And I would say it's one of those kind of like, and possibly the Winter Night trilogy could fall into this camp too, but more so Mercedes Lackey's trilogy, where the first book feels very YA. The character is a very young protagonist. It's a magical school trope. There's a mentor trope. A lot of the classic YA tropes in that particular first book.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that she did an amazing job, an amazing approach to theme that I think you could appreciate as an adult. And then the second and third book, it's such a mix. It does the thing that YA trilogies do all the time, where it becomes, and I think Winter Night does this a little bit too, honestly. It becomes way more romance focused. I don't know, Winter Night, maybe I shouldn't even compare it, but it becomes way more romance focused in the second book. I noticed YA trilogies love to do that. And then but then the third book, I mean, without giving away spoilers, there's some really graphic sexual violence. And it's not graphically depicted on the page, but it happens. And it's like, well, where do you draw the line now? It's weird. Yeah. There's so many weird questions to this discussion.
Well, and then if you think about the different books that we're required to read in school too, and like, okay, so that's a YA audience, right? But classics don't distinguish. I think about, when you're talking about graphic violence, I think about I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings depicts that, but that's often encouraged to read. It's either encouraged that you read it in school or it's banned in schools. It's like one or the other, right? But I remember reading that when I was younger, and yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting topic.
It's so interesting. I've actually wanted to do a video about this for a while, and I've been actually looking up a lot of sort of non-related topics to relate it. But yeah, it's just an interesting topic. And honestly, I know the YA label is one that's fairly modern in terminology. Like, I know that one of the first YA books was published in the 50s or something. I think it's The Outsiders. I could be wrong about that, but there are a lot of videos about that.
I loved The Outsiders growing up.
I never read it, but I heard that like it wasn't initially intended for YA, but then they found that in stores, adults weren't picking it up, but then they found younger audiences were, and that's when I think book marketers started realizing, hey, we could start a book marketing thing where we tailor things towards younger audiences and then tailor books towards older audiences. And I don't think, obviously that wasn't a thing with classic literature. So it's a modern convention, and it's one that is really tricky. I don't even know how they decide. I don't know how the marketing world decides this. I've actually tried to look this up online, how the marketing world decides what books should be YA and what books should be adult.
And new adult.
I know that and new adult. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if they start like a pre-middle-aged category and then a middle-aged category, and then I am out. I am quitting reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be crazy. Yeah. Yeah. And I actually, Liam would be an interesting person to talk to too, because he knows a lot about the early roots of and Philip too, like early fairy tales, and how, of course, fantasy was acknowledged as being like fairy stories for children. Yeah. Right. And so it's come a long way in even being acknowledged as adult literature. So it's just
I think the Grimm brothers had a lot to do with that specifically, because the narratives were really dark and it wasn't the classic and they lived happily ever after. But I think part of that too is we have this kind of Disneyfied version of what a lot of fairy tales look like, and we think like elves or, really lovely people that are just like these wood nymphs that live in the forest, or that,
They're not?
right? And that like fairies are really friendly. And I'm like, they could murder you and steal your children. The type of stories where these myths actually come from. And it kind of got distorted over time, I think.
And it's interesting because I know that there were darker type of, when did the Grimm brothers, actually maybe I should ask that, like the brothers, the Grimm brothers?
I believe
Or Brothers Grimm?
1800s, Brothers Grimm, yeah.
That's
Brothers.
okay. That makes sense to me. Because I know there's a classical song, not that it's based on that,
Yeah.
but I know like in the romantic era music played on a lot of fantasy connections. And there's even like a song that Schubert wrote. He didn't write the poem. I think it was Heinrich Heine, but I could be wrong about that. But the poem that the Erlkönig, which is the Elf King, is a really dark song. Like it's about this elf. You know it? So
I
like
do. Yeah.
that kills children, basically.
Yes.
On horseback. It's a really good song. Highly recommend it. Thank you, Philip. It was coined in the 1960s, but the prose of YA books like Wizard of Earthsea back then is more sophisticated. It's interesting about prose in the prose of the adult fantasy books these days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you could definitely notice a difference in prose over the last few decades.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Really interesting. So, do either of you have a favorite type of prose style that you gravitate towards? Just curious about that. Or like
Not
a writer
really.
that you love their prose with fantasy?
Oh, a writer specifically. I mean, go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, it's not something that's hugely important to me, but I'd say if I'm thinking about the writing of a book that moved me the most, it has to be A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. I think that's probably the most exquisite writing I've read.
Dowry of Blood. I'm trying to think if that sounds familiar to me or not. Interesting. Oh, nice. Oh, I have seen that before. Yes, I saw that. I think a friend of mine was reading that. I can't remember what they thought of that book.
I think you'd really enjoy it. It's not too long. It is beautiful.
I think I saw that on another BookTube channel that is not in this corner of BookTube, but on a totally different part of BookTube. And the person was like listening to the audio initially and then switched to the physical book because they loved the prose so much and they started to like wanting to annotate the book. Okay, cool.
It's just like if I was annotating it, I'd be highlighting and underlining every single line. It is powerful. It's beautiful. And it's a really interesting take. It's an interesting perspective. It's from one of Dracula's wives, and she's writing letters to him. And so it's told, I think it might be considered second person. I can't remember if it's second person all the way through, but it's
weird. I have heard of that book before. That sounds really interesting. Second person.
Add to the TBR.
That's so hard to pull off. Yeah, that sounds really hard to pull off. I'll have to check that out. And what about you, Laura?
So the first time I feel like I ever really noticed prose was when I read Homer for the first time. So, which if you get into the history of Homer, it's kind of like a Shakespeare thing where a lot of people are like, it's not one person, it was many people, whatever. But thematically, the voice sounds and tonally sounds the same throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I love the Odyssey is one of my all-time favorite stories ever. So that was the first time that I really noticed prose and fell in love with similes. So that for me was a big thing. And recently, it's definitely been Piranesi and then The Lions of Valversan. Those have been the two where I've noticed most distinguishably. I'm like, oh, these are beautiful prose, which reading GGK, and I then read Sanderson right after. Kyle from Read by Kyle, I was talking to him about Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, and he's like, the problem might be that you just read GGK. And I'm like,
oh, it's absolutely the problem. It's absolutely the problem.
But prose is normally the top of my list. I don't generally distinguish if it's good or bad. I kind of just enjoy it as it goes. But there's the odd time, like with Piranesi and GGK, where you're like, this is beautiful. And it just resonates and hits a little bit differently, I think.
So I used to be the same way. I used to think that prose didn't matter. I I feel like I'm a total prose snob, and I've been trying to be in denial about it, but it doesn't work. I think I just have to accept it because, and I think that it's interesting because you could start to appreciate really beautiful prose, or just start to recognize the effect prose has on you without being able to distinguish exactly what the prose is doing, like the specific techniques involved. So that's where I'm at right now. I'm trying to understand different techniques that authors use. Like obviously simile and metaphor, those are techniques. But there are a lot of different techniques I think that authors use in order to pull us into a story. But it's funny because you can be unconscious of how prose is affecting you until you read something that's like really good prose and then you contrast it with something else.
Yeah.
And I had that same problem when I was reading Malazan because I started to just love Stephen Eric. I love Stephen Erickson's prose. I love it. And then I tried to read different books after reading that series and it was really tough. I was like, it just felt like everything felt very tonally void after reading Malazan. And it wasn't a fair comparison at all because obviously different styles are trying to do different things. Different authors have different goals. But I'm getting some interesting comments here. And I just wanted to say that's really fun that you said Goethe is the goat. And then here, Joanna, I know everybody says that, I don't know how to say his last name, Rocchio's prose, that, wow, it's even better than GGK. That's amazing.
That's high praise.
That is high praise. Yeah. I have heard that. I've heard that he has very beautiful prose. Absolutely. But if you're unconscious of how prose can affect you, I want to go ahead and bring up, since Laura, you said you're a huge Grimdark fan. Both of you have now read the First Law trilogy, and I'd be curious to hear thoughts on that because honestly, I think that the reason that the books are so effective, the reason why the characters are so good and so complex, the reason that the humor is so good and the action, all of those things are the result of Abercrombie being a genius when it comes to prose, in my opinion. I think he has an incredible gift with rhythm with his prose, and he knows how to contrast characters and scenes like brilliantly. But yeah, any thoughts? But we don't have to make it about his prose specifically, but just thoughts on Abercrombie.
I love him so much. I like if I wasn't married and I came across Joe Abercrombie, I'd be like, you and I would be very well matched.
If you two weren't married.
No, it's just in the interviews that I've seen with him, I'm like, he and I, same level of interest in the type of stories. I love dark humor. For me, it's just one of my absolute favorite things. I love satire, and that's definitely woven into First Law. But Glokta is my favorite character of all time. I love Glokta so much. I even talked about him in my mid-year book tag that he is my book crush probably forever. I love him.
Yeah.
So I love Abercrombie. I have a very Abercrombie stamp on my heart.
Oh,
so.
Yeah. Abercrombie is amazing. And yes, well, Philip, I did read that essay and
I read it
also
too.
agree.
You sent it to me.
Oh, that's right. Laura read it too, because I added it to the Discord, in the Grimoire Discord. I absolutely agree with everything she says. And I agree with Philip's take on what she says, because he did a wonderful video about this and explained why she explains how prose is the world building. Like, you can't really separate the prose and the world building. I would say you can't separate the prose from anything in a story, really. Well, maybe plot, maybe you can make a case for that, but a lot of it is developed through the prose. And Philip also added, though, too, that there can be an openness to, and I'm sorry, Philip, I'm like paraphrasing you probably poorly, but you can make a case for prose evolving and changing over time too, that we have to account for that. Just like we said, classic novels don't read exactly the same as modern day novels. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Glad to hear about your Glokta crush again.
Yeah, always.
Yes. And Jack, loved hearing your First Law. I loved your First Law vlog. It was wonderful. So, yeah. Any continuing thoughts about that since you finished?
Well, I did not leave with any bookish crushes like Laura did from that. Except for maybe Abercrombie. Like I said, I'm still deciding if Grimdark is for me, but I was blown away by Abercrombie's writing style. I think humor is the most difficult thing to pull off in a book. and it was dripping with humor in the first several pages. And I think that's why it worked for me, because you have this violence. You have not necessarily happy endings or closed resolutions to things. And to balance that out with like this lighter thing, I think it's the only reason I was able to get through it, because it added so many different layers of complexity to it. And oh my gosh, Glocka is an incredible character. Absolutely incredible. The sarcasm there, a horrible character. He's a bad guy, but you're still rooting for him. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, is he? Absolutely. Like, do you want to be trapped in an elevator with him? No. But so you're rooting for him. You want him to succeed. Well, he's brilliant. I mean, an intelligent character is really what gets me every time. So what made that trilogy work for me is the writing style. Absolutely. It was incredible, because not everything in that trilogy worked for me, but that's what puts it in the liked category for me. So
I agree, though. Humor is the hardest thing to do correctly. And I think that's why we see so little of it in fantasy, because it is really hard to do. But I was rolling, I think, by like page 10. And I wrote Bookborn because I have gone into every read I've done this year blind. And I just saw that she had reviewed First Law and really liked it. And I was like, okay, I'll give it a go. Wrote her and was like, are these books meant to be funny? Because I don't know. And she's like, oh yeah, they're actually quite humorous. And I was like, okay, good. Because they're so funny.
Well, as a lover of simile, I would recommend checking out his use of simile, because I feel like he delivers a lot of humor through his simile.
100%.
And there's actually a wonderful interview with him about prose over on Murphy Napier's channel.
I've watched it.
Yeah, everybody's watched it. But what's funny is that many people I've talked to still remember things he said in that particular interview about how he was taught from his mother to write very honestly.
Yeah.
So like if you're looking at the night sky, you wouldn't say like, I can't remember the exact analogy he used or the exact metaphor he used or whatever, but it was like, the sky is like the stars are shining like diamonds, that simile. It's like, but are they really? Like, be honest. Like, so the honesty he uses, I think, is what makes his similes very accurate and very effective. And then all the more like perfect at hitting the humor. Like, I just think that's how he delivers the humor so well. One of the ways. There are a lot of different ways.
And I think with prose, I think about the way I converse with my boyfriend about what I'm reading. So my boyfriend is not a reader. He's a movie buff. He wants to watch all the movie adaptations with me. But if I'm describing a book to him, which he would rather I don't, but if I'm describing it, you can easily describe plot, characters, tone, sometimes the world building and the magic system. But to communicate what the prose is like is very difficult. If you had to describe, describing Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy and what makes it special is very difficult. It's because it's something that the humor, it's not like a one-liner, like a knock-knock joke that makes it so funny, right? Like I can't tell my boyfriend like, oh, he said this and then he said that, and that's why it's so funny. It's not something that conveys if I'm just trying to describe it to him, like it is with all these other categories. Yeah. It's just this writing style that flows throughout the book that ties everything together, brings it together, and that's really what makes it so unique.
Yeah.
When I was describing First Law to a friend of ours, I was like, it's like The Sopranos, but better and in a book. Because if you like that really dark humor, and that to me was the closest media equivalent in the sense that it's dark, there's violence, but it's humorous. So I was like, This is how I describe First Law. And he's going to read it soon. So I'm excited.
Oh, that's good.
That's exciting. Yeah.
I was describing it to my boyfriend. I was like, and then Glotka found stairs and he hates stairs. My boyfriend's like, why are you cracking up about this? Like, you just have to be there.
Yeah, it's really kind of like almost like a dark, witty humor. Some would call it a maybe gallows humor. There's a lot of sarcasm to the wit, and he plays off the darker parts of the human condition. He makes you laugh at it. Yeah. And so I think that's what's so brilliant. But there's definitely like it's funny because I'm right now trying to understand more about rhythm, the element of rhythm in prose. And every time I try to think about a good example of rhythm in prose, my mind automatically wants to go to Abercrombie because intuitively that was what I felt. And maybe because I also listened to the audiobook narration while I was reading, but
So
I was like,
good.
there's just such a rhythm. Like, and maybe it's Pacey's narration giving me
Yeah.
that feedback too, but there's such a way that he structures his sentences that feels rhythmic to me. It feels like the way he's altering the short and long sentences. And I know that's something that a lot of authors consciously do. He
Mhm.
does it in such a way that it feels like it's getting you in. And another thing he does that Martin does as well, and I didn't really pay attention to this until Jimmy brought it up for A Song of Ice and Fire, is that you'll start to notice that a lot of the chapters begin almost in the middle of a conversation. And so you're immediately like right there with the characters.
Mhm.
Like, oh, or it's in the middle of a scene. So it's like
Yeah.
that in medias res kind of action. And you're just like, oh, wow, I'm already hooked into the scene. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So he has a way of doing that or punctuating the end of a chapter with almost like a humorous joke or there's almost like a down note, but it feels like it's an unresolved cadence sort of, but a
Yeah.
cadence. So it has a way of propelling you through the story with those kind of things.
It's so human, first law. That's the thing. I mean, when we read, let's say, A Song of Ice and Fire, for example, people might say, oh, I wish I was like Daenerys and like things like that. And I'm like, you can see characteristics of these people. But when I read Jazal specifically, I was like, I know him. Like, I've met this guy. I've been in gym class with this kid. Like, I know the essence of this person. And I found that so much while reading Abercrombie. I was like, these are real people. And I mean, I love that too about A Song of Ice and Fire. Some of the characters specifically, like Brienne, I'm like, totally get where she's coming from in terms of dealing with her feminism or lack of feminism, or not feminism in the sense of like the feminist movement, but feminism in the sense of like her femininity. But with Abercrombie, it was like each character, I was like, I recognize so many traits of these people in people that I've met. And I thought that was probably the first time that I had that deep of an experience with that. But Jazal specifically, I was like, I could name probably 10 men off the top of my head that I know that are just like, so I thought that was even more endearing for me while reading it because it felt so real.
That's kind of sad.
It is. It is. But at the same time, it's like, I'm not friends with these people, but I've met these people. So I'm like, I know exactly who he's talking about. And it seemed very relatable in that way. So yeah, I thought it was brilliantly done.
I know a lot of people always say that they're surprised how funny. They're like, I thought this was grimdark and it's so funny. But was this your introduction to grim? This was your introduction to grimdark, right, Jack?
Well, kind of. No, because I read Game of Thrones with you earlier this year.
Oh, that's right. I don't know. Yeah.
And then the second one, what is it called? The gold one. So I read those two, and then First Law.
Okay. Yeah.
So. Game of Thrones was my first introduction as well. The book, A Game of Thrones. Yeah.
It's interesting because I mean, I know the term grimdark is also a modern convention, and it wasn't ever anybody's intent. A lot of these authors, they never intended their books to be called grimdark, and I understand that. Even Joe Abercrombie, he calls himself tried to handle Lord Grimdark on Twitter, but that's a joke. So
because he doesn't want people referring to it as grimdark. He's actively said he's like, it's not grimdark. It's grimy and it's dark, but it's not grimdark. I'm like,
well, almost every author says that too. That I've seen. I've only known a couple of authors that have embraced that term.
Yeah,
and I, I honestly I love, as I said in episode 18, I really love Kronk the book guy. I like his definition of grimdark the best that I've heard. I think it's the best I've heard, but overall I've kind of tried to step away from that term because I feel like so many people use it differently. And I'm a little nervous about genre wars. I'm curious about genre wars too, because I do get curious about how things are labeled and why. So it's something that it's always an ongoing curiosity for me. But at the same time, I'm like, oh man, like for a while there were like so many videos going around BookTube where people were arguing what grimdark means. And I'm like, oh, I'll just step away.
Yeah, exactly.
And to me, it seems like it's more defining, like, and I could be completely off, but my impression of it is that it's telling you how it's going to make you feel in a lot of ways. Like, you're not going to feel warm and fuzzy. It's kind of like there's cozy fantasy and grimdark are kind of like opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So like if I'm having a bad day, like work was bad, or like, you know, something, like I'm not going to probably gravitate towards a grimdark fantasy to cheer myself up. I'm just not.
I do.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know, because then you also have a lot of fantasy, not cozy fantasy, but you also have a lot of fantasy that I would say, like even Lord of the Rings. That's definitely not what I would consider grimdark. But there are, you know, in book 3, there's definitely some scenes that are pretty, that feel kind of dark and heavy. So that wouldn't be what I'd probably read if I wanted to pick me up or to feel cheerful necessarily.
I mean, you
Maybe
can
the
even
first
say
part.
that about YA books, like talking about Narnia earlier, book 7, where if you're familiar with the Narnia series, even Neil Gaiman wrote an essay on it called The Susan Problem, where it's like you think you're going to get this happy ending, and then you find out Susan isn't getting into Narnia, and you're like, okay. So like you can deal with really dark themes and violence in a lot of these cases in places that you're not necessarily attributing the overall story to being a grimdark story or a darker story. But yeah, it's just, it likes to rear its head in awkward places at times.
I love AP's comment here. Science fiction always wins the genre wars because they have planet destroying weapons. Yep, they win. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, some people do think it's kind of a useless label.
Yeah.
I can understand the case for that as well. But I can also understand the case for using it because, like Jack said, I know it's tricky because we're also coming up with other things even in YA, but what Jack said is true. And I think to the extent that, like, if somebody were to tell me this is grimdark, to me, that I'm usually going to guess that where we land at the end of the story might not be the same thing as like Mistborn. I don't know, without giving away spoilers for Mistborn, you know, like, or something that's like really, really hopeful and heroic. Maybe I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, what was I going to say now? I forgot what my next question was going to be. Oh yeah, let's see. I'm curious about the history of the phase grimdark because I remember hearing it referring to darker 80s comics. Interesting.
I think Bookborn did a video on that. If you're looking for one, she talked about morally gray characters and grimdark specifically, and gave kind of a history and timeline for that. So she'd probably be a good video.
Well, the term grimdark actually came from a game, a tabletop game called Warhammer. Yeah. So I don't know if I don't think she mentioned that in the video, but
I can't remember.
Yeah, but it's the morally gray character too. I also I think that's also like, what do you mean by that? You know?
Yeah.
I always want to unpack that particular question. Oh, here. Yeah. The term was borrowed and repurposed from Warhammer 40K. Thank you.
Yeah.
In the grim darkness in the far future, there is only war. Yeah.
I agree with you though, Joanna. I'm kind of over the morally gray label just because I think it's kind of that hero's journey thing we were talking about earlier, where we've gotten so accustomed to the fact that there's a hero and they're classically good and their journey is against someone that's classically evil. And we're now starting to see stories where it's a bit more complicated than that. And everyone's like, well, they're morally gray. I'm like, or are they just more human? You know,
it's really tricky. Yeah, it's really tricky to characterize humans, even as gray, can almost feel reductive sometimes.
Yes.
So I understand what you mean. But, you know, I think, you know, this is where it's tricky because I don't mean to be snobby about people using those terms. Like if they want to use it, because I think sometimes those words are a starting point of conversation or of understanding literature. And so we all have to start somewhere. And then from there, we can maybe expand a bit and be like, okay, well, what do I mean by this? As long as we're willing to just unpack it. I don't think there's anything wrong with using the term grimdark or using the terms morally gray, as long as people are willing to unpack what they mean by that. That would be my only suggestion by that. But I would be curious.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm commenting on what Talking Story is saying. I think that labels are, generally sales tools. But it can be a good sales tool, because if you know that you like romance and fantasy and you go into your local bookstore and you see stuff labeled as romance fantasy, you're like, okay, I might like that more. So yeah, I mean, it can be good and it can be a bad thing, even if it is just a sales tool.
No,
Yeah,
100%. Yeah.
I agree with that. It's hard because the terms are so ambiguous and mean different things to different people. But
Yeah.
for me, I'm more of a mood reader. So I need to pair the right book for the right time for me for it to be successful, right? If you throw a grim dark at me when I'm looking for a happy ending, I want a satisfying conclusion, I want characters I can root for, and you throw like some of these grim darks at me, like I'm going to rate it poorly. I won't trash it, but like if someone asks me for a book recommendation, I'm not going to recommend it. I want the right expectations going into a book. So those sales tools work for me, I think.
Oh, I love this point that you're making too, because Jack, because I think you're absolutely right. I say the same thing about covers. Some people say, oh, there used to be way more emphasis on the idea that the cover doesn't matter. And on the one hand, they're right. And on the other hand, they're wrong, because we are getting subconscious messages from what we see on the cover. If I were to look at Philip's book, The Way of Edan, and if it had a teddy bear on the cover, I think I would get the wrong idea about what the story was about. I'd be like, Philip, are you sure this is an adult fantasy trilogy or epic fantasy with the teddy bear on the cover? So, I think that obviously there is something to be said for even labels. Labels are the same thing. We get certain expectations from them. But at the same time, I think it just depends. Like on the one hand, if you're kind of going for an overall vibe, those things can be helpful. And at the same time, for some people, they might need to be unpacked a little bit more too. So I think it just depends on where you're coming from with that.
Agreed. I'm also a mood reader. It's why I've stopped doing TBRs and things like that, because I will put a list of things out there and I'm like, didn't feel like reading these. Yeah.
Yay. I can't wait to see that stained glass window teddy bear.
It'll be Paddington and stained glass.
Yeah. Okay. I got a question here. Would you mind telling us what that definition is? I haven't heard about that BookTube person describe it. So using his name. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. It's in my last episode 18. Sorry. And it's also on the Book Guy's video. He does a whole overview of the First Lost series, but I will try to unpack the definition. He just gave basic criteria for what goes along with grimdark, and I'm trying to remember all of the things. I know that he talked about how they're the end, and he put it in a way that they aren't absolutes, like you don't have to exactly have these things, but that these are just generally higher probabilities in grimdark, if that makes sense. So I think one of the things he talked about is how sometimes the action might be anticlimactic rather than you're building up to this big climax. Sometimes it's like, it's anticlimactic. Sometimes, what does he say? I cannot remember some of the other ones. Gosh, now I'm like drawing a blank here. Do you remember, Laura?
I think he did mention morally gray characters.
Did he? He said, yeah. I don't think he used the term
not quite in that way, but I think it was that you have characters that you might not necessarily be rooting for, but kind of getting into more nuanced levels of that. But yeah, I think we talked about characters as well.
Yeah. So yeah, the general story arc might not go the way that you would expect it to go in a more hopeful way.
Yeah.
And let's see. I'm trying to think. So battle scenes might be anticlimactic. I know he talked about the sex scenes being more like, what did he say? More realistic in a way, and maybe more awkward. And which is definitely the case in Abercrombie's first Law series.
100%.
And I'm trying to think. There were some other things he said too that were really interesting. It was an interesting discussion. I'm sorry I'm drawing a blank on some of these, but I do recommend checking out that episode.
All of his videos are really, really great, honestly. He's just so balanced, and he's not giving his opinion, which is so interesting because I feel like it's hard to do that. It's kind of like doing a spoiler-free review, which I suck at because I just have so many things I want to say about it that I wouldn't be able to do what he does. I think he's very he's very articulate.
Yes, I agree. I think he has a great channel because his mission is not to tell you exactly whether he thinks you should read it or like it based on his feelings. He wants to
Yeah.
give you an overall view of the story, and then you can decide for yourself if this might be your next read. So I like his mission. I think that it's a wonderful mission, and he happens to be extremely well read without talking down to his audience, which I think is also a great skill. Yeah. So, I like that. Yeah, morally gray to me means the human heart in conflict with itself. Isn't that all of us though? I think William Faulkner said that, but I might be wrong. It's a great quote and fantastic. Yeah, so I would be a lot of squelching in the first law. So, oh, what? A William Morris wallpaper with teddy bears? All right. And I'm glad that people are going with the teddy bear idea that I put out there. I'm really excited to see it. I'm really excited to see it. So, so Laura, you were saying, I'm going back to what you were saying originally. So you said that you really like grimdark, but like, what are some other aside from A Song of Ice and Fire and First Law? Are there any other types of stories that you've enjoyed that are kind of along those lines, or that have those kind of characters that you enjoy?
I'm trying
Or
to
that
think
are
about it.
written by women. I'd love to know.
I haven't had any that have been written by women. I'm trying to think about it, and I'm kind of drawing a blank just because it's been a really long gap. So I read A Song of Ice and Fire 12 years ago. And then I have just read First Law this year. So my sample size isn't massive for grimdark, but it's definitely the one that I want to keep going back to and reading more of. But I'm trying to think if there's any other, especially that I've read in this year. And I don't think there is. I don't think so. I haven't read Malazan yet. So
yeah.
it's on my list.
Another author who does not like the grimdark title at all.
Yeah.
At all. And actually, I would agree. And everybody argues with me about this because they'll start the series. And if you read Dead House Gates or even Beginning of Memories of Ice, books 2 and 3, people are like, this is definitely grimdark. What are you talking about? And I'm like, yes, but it's for me. And, again, people can use the grimdark label. I mean, I guess it just depends on what they mean by that and how they're defining it. But for me, it's like where the series lands, like where we end up. But it's a tricky conversation. But yeah, I wonder what you would think of that series. Now, as far as female, to answer Jack's question, though, I don't know of many female grimdark writers, except I know the name Anna Sparks. I want to say Anna Sparks Smith.
Yeah, we put that in the comments. Yeah.
Oh, is it already in the comments?
Yeah.
Thank you. AP is like beating me to everything I'm saying in this particular. Thank you, EP. I appreciate it. Anna Smith Spark. Thank you. Yeah, another great grimdark author.
So my husband, I got him her book, her first one of her series, and he did not like it at all. He liked it up until like the last 15 pages, and I was like, oh no. So I've been reluctant to read it because of that, because he and I tend to be on the same wavelength for those type of stories. But I know it is really well loved by many other people.
Yeah. No, AP, I did not mean that. I was totally teasing you. I love your comments and I appreciate it because I would have butchered the name anyway. So thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had it described to me that like for a male grimdark author, it might feel like it's written more for shock value when someone's testicles are nailed to a wall. But when the woman author, grimdark author, does it, it's very satisfying, and you're like, yeah, nail those to the wall. Like it's like satisfying and encouraging. So I'm curious if I will draw that parallel. So I'm anxious to try a female author.
I always find that interesting, that line where it's male and female. And I used to get into this conversation a lot with people in terms of sexual violence in their stories, because the classic tale is A Song of Ice and Fire, is what people like to say is, George R. R. Martin likes to write violence against women. And I would always counteract that and say, well, have you read Outlander? And what do you think of Outlander? Because Diana Gabaldon, or Gabaldon, however you want to pronounce her last name, notoriously also writes rape scenes, and they are explicit rape scenes, and they are to both men and women. And I'm like, she does not shy away from this. So why is it we excuse it for one and we don't excuse it for the other? And I think a lot of the time it's because she's not typically classified as fantasy. And I'm like, this is so weird to me. And it's because it's a woman. They're like, well, it's a woman author. And I'm like, does that matter? Like when we get down to the nitty gritty of it, doesn't matter if the content is essentially the same that's being written on the page, if the gender of the author really is the baseline of what we're judging these things on. So I always just think that that's a really interesting conversation when I see that kind of thing happening in terms of discussing male authors and female authors and what they put on. Hey, Alan.
We have a guest who popped in. Hello.
Yeah, I didn't want to jump in and make a weird face that would undermine the topic that's being talked about. So I was just gonna sit here and wait for my
what?
Yeah. No, continue. I just came in and I was like, I thought people were gonna be talking about like, yeah, but and then it's like whoa. Like as soon as I was backstage, I went, whoa. So,
oh no.
to listen while I eat.
Okay.
Like you.
No, it's an interesting topic. It sure is. I'm curious too. And I'd be really curious, Jack, if you do pick up any sort of female grimdark author, I would definitely click on that vlog within a heartbeat. I love your vlogs in general, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that topic. Now, I know for me, I mean, like we were talking about how there are violent scenes in YA. I read a book, Girls of Paper and Fire, so many years ago. There are some brutal, I mean, it's not explicitly on the page, but there are brutal sexually violent scenes. I mean, it's very heavy on the sexual violence in that particular book. And then another one that I read, well, the Mercedes Lackey's trilogy, as I said, it blurs the lines, in my opinion, between starting out feeling very YA and then getting more adult as you go on. But I mean, it has some pretty brutal things. And I did know that going in, because I know that I saw a lot on Goodreads. There were some people who did reviews and they were saying that things about how there were people who were angry at Mercedes Lackey for having sexual violence in her books. And apparently she has a lot of she was called out for having sexual violence in several of her books, but I don't really know because I've only read that one trilogy. But I don't know. I mean, it certainly is a thing. And I don't know. I can understand if people are expecting one thing and getting something different, but
yeah.
Well, and I think, Laura's comment of, women can write it too. Why is it more okay when they do it? That plays into the larger topic of conversation that we always have on BookTube is, who has the right to tell a story and profit from a story that's not theirs. If it's like men writing about women's issues, or you get into race, or, there's so many different aspects of it. And so I think that kind of adds into that topic as well. Men writing violence against women, is it less okay for them to do it versus a female author?
I love that topic. And I talked about it not that long ago with Wheel of Time specifically, because Wheel of Time gets praised for being this innovative story and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, the ideas are Asian and East Asian primarily, with the Wheel of Samsara, Rebirth, like all of these things. And it is such an interesting conversation of who is allowed to tell what stories. Are our stories our own anymore? Should we be acknowledging where our inspiration comes from? Like, is cultural appropriation part of this story now? It's so layered, but it's really fascinating when you get into fantasy specifically, because it's repeat stories of each other just being told in different ways. So yeah, it's really, really fascinating.
It is really fascinating. I personally, I honestly, I think I err on the side of being supportive and open-minded to somebody writing a story from a perspective that's not their own. Of course, that can be done on different levels of sensitivity. And of course, it's always, I would think that most of those writers, I would hope that they would get sensitivity readers if possible. But I do think that that's I applaud that personally. I applaud somebody's a writer's decision to explore that. It's like, I know, Jack, you were talking on your channel. Is it Mary? Is that the name of the book? A book that a male author wrote. You want to tell us about that book?
Yeah, so it's actually one of my contenders for a favorite book of the year. It's definitely in the favorite horror category of the year. So Mary is a book written by Nat Cassidy, who is male. And it is kind of like, it's inspired by Stephen King's Carrie, which actually might be another comparison we can draw, a male author writing about a young girl. But in Mary, it's about a woman going through menopause and all these weird things that start happening to her at this time, and how doctors dismiss her, just society dismisses her as an aging woman. And I honestly didn't think anything of it. And Nat Cassidy, that could go female or male. I didn't realize it was a male author until the author's note at the end. And he addressed it, do I have a right to tell this story? I'm a man writing about a woman. How would I understand women's troubles and what they go through, and ageism? And his argument for it was so fascinating. And I really feel like he did the story justice and did it respectfully. And how he explained it just made a lot of sense. And I really appreciated that author's note at the end.
So that's an interesting discussion that we're having right now. And I'm gonna approach this and try not to like make everyone in the world mad, because I don't know what makes people mad anymore. Like I'm literally just gonna try to, like, I get confused sometimes because I understand and I agree with like what we're saying. I'm just like, most of the people who write fantasy are white dudes. Like, and again, I'm speaking from a position of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Like, I couldn't be from a more non-oppressed, demographic. But the thing is, like, I'm always confused, because if people want more than just like white Anglo-Saxon dudes in fantasy, like, I get that the ideal is to have more people who aren't white Anglo-Saxon dudes writing fantasy. But in the absence of that, isn't it better that white Anglo-Saxon dudes are putting people who aren't white Anglo-Saxon dudes like in the story? Because I see people cry for more representation, which is good. And then I see people getting mad at people for including representation because they're not from that particular demographic. And it literally confuses me. I'm literally not trying to be insensitive right now. If I am, please forgive me. I have autism. But I don't like, does that make sense?
It does. Yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah. That's
they get mad when they do it. Right?
Yeah, that's the big argument. But I think, kind of the response I've seen to that, and actually the book Yellowface by R.F. Kuang gives you a lot of insight into this too. But it's interesting because I agree with that. And the issue, I think, or one of the issues might sit with the publishers who put more of their budget behind the white male authors. And they may have one slot for one person of color. And then if that slot's filled, like, tough luck, nobody else can get that marketing budget.
Yeah.
And so you'll have the same story from like maybe a person of color or something, and then the white males, and all their budget is going towards that.
Yeah.
So there was a book I read, not fantasy, but it's called My Dark Vanessa.
I love that book.
Yeah. So the controversy around that book, I think, is that it was written by a white female, but the story was originally published, a very similar story, from, I think, a Latina author. And she did not receive nearly the same amount of budget and publicity. And obviously, it's a story that a lot of women can relate to. It's not a unique story, but the issue is how the publishing industry emphasizes certain authors over others. So
I didn't know that backstory to this. I did not know that backstory.
Yeah.
And that sucks. Like, the system blows, right? Like, I'm all, if you want to talk about like corrupt system and bring it down, like, call me. I'll come in the army.
We'll ride into battle together.
Seriously, let's rip it down from the wallpaper. But it's like, I don't know. It just always confuses me. Like when I see people write who don't, it's rare. But when people write about like autistic kids or autistic characters and they're not autistic, it's like, I mean, you get some things right and you get some things wrong. I mean, I don't care. Dude, look at the autistic kid. We're not quite all like that. But you know, whatever. But it's also like, I am a huge fan of Japan and have always been, and I studied Japan. And no, I am a gaijin. Like, I'm not a Nihonjin. But like, why can't I write about samurai? Like,
that'd be cool.
About samurai because now I'm trying to culturally appropriate the Japanese. Like, I'm not, like, it's just confusing to me. And if you want to, like, if you are an aspiring like writer, if you want to write about stuff, like, how do you navigate that? Can I only write about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant dudes? And
no,
like,
I think honestly, the best thing that authors can do in that situation is in a foreword or a postscript and just saying, this is my experience with this culture. In your case, it's, I've loved Japanese culture for this long. I've studied it. I've done all of these things, you know, and like acknowledging that this isn't necessarily yours, but the appreciation and love for it is there. And I think that is all it takes for most people. It's just when there is this blatant lack of acknowledgement where people are like, I came up with this really innovative and wonderful idea and it's 100% mine. And all these cultures of people are going, it's absolutely not yours. It's been ours for the last 5,000 years. What are you talking about? And then all of this praise gets attributed to that person as if they were the innovator of that idea. And I think it's allowing people who have the origin of that thing to acknowledge them and acknowledge their voice, even though it's still your story.
Yeah.
And doing it justice without stereotyping, right?
Yes.
So like also comparing it also again to Yellowface. But that's a story, if you're not familiar, where two authors, one is a highly successful Asian author, the other is a struggling white author. The Asian author dies, the white author steals her manuscript and publishes it as her own. The book is about Chinese suffering. And so it's exactly that topic. Like, as a white person, does she have the right to tell a story and profit from another culture's suffering? And I think what adds into that is through the publishing process, they whitewash the story. So they purposely give you sympathetic white characters in the story, and they tone things down to make it digestible to white readers. And I think that might be an area too where it gets extra complex. You have to do the story justice. You have to stay true to it, and you can't stereotype it or make a joke of it. So I would read what you wrote about samurais, Alan.
What a good discussion this is. Like,
yeah, I didn't expect it going this route.
Yeah,
Those are really, really great suggestions, both of you. Thank you, all three of you.
I mean, sometimes as a white man, it is sometimes hard on the internet, especially, to even voice, like, here, I'm with Joanna. Like, I know Joanna, and I have autism. I can always fall back on, like, I didn't know I'm autistic. But like saying, you know, I don't want people to be like, oh, well, you just don't understand because it's like, no, I'm trying to understand. Like, sometimes people are asking questions not to be the patronizing, like, well, what about this? Like, I'm not trying to do that. I am literally trying to understand what the right thing is and how we navigate it. Now, the fact that there's one slot for people who aren't like white guys is,
yeah,
like stop, like, publish some books, Orbit, like, or whoever it is, like, or at least
you
Orbit.
need the honey witch, Alan.
Orbit needs to dial it back and like stop finding everything on TikTok. Like, Orbit, look somewhere else, please. Tor.
The thing too is they often will give white authors more of a second chance with their second novel if their first novel doesn't perform as well. And people of color, especially women of color, your first go is like it.
I'm not sure
if it doesn't perform really well.
I don't really know what your race has to do with your ability to construct a story. Like,
it doesn't.
I know plenty of white people who write awful, just terrible.
Yeah.
You know, I think that where I find this subject to be a little bit challenging is as a reviewer who is not of the demographic. So, like, for example, I'll give you a good example, actually. I think this is an amazing book. I loved this book. To Ride Hell's Chasm by Jenny Wirtz touches on the theme of racism in that story with a Black character. And I thought it was so well done. I thought it was so impressive. I thought it was so nuanced. And I was amazed that Jenny Wirtz, who was not a person of color, was able to write such a complex, nuanced story that that dived into that theme in a fantasy world and a fantasy story and setting. And at the same time, part of me might have been a little nervous to be like the one to say this was done well, because I'm not a person of color. You know what? I technically am, because I'm Hispanic, but I'm not a Black person, right? I'm not a Black male. I'm not the person who is being explored or the type of person who's being represented in that story. And I fortunately can point to somebody like P.L. Stewart, who is a Black male author and who loves that book, who actually promotes it as one of his favorite books of all time, did a fantastic review, both on video and on Goodreads, about that book. And so for me, that feels validating that I could say, this is a great book. But there's also part of me when I don't have other voices to draw from who are representative of what's being represented in the book, where I feel a little nervous. Like, is this doing an okay job? And how can I speak of it as a reviewer if I'm not of that representation? Like, I can't speak of that, right? But does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And I think, you can always, it's difficult if it's a book about racism, you said, right? Written by a white person.
Mm-hmm.
So assuming it's done well, it's difficult because I think the argument would be, is a white person profiting off of Black suffering? And I think that's where it gets kind of tricky. But, could you pair it with a similar book that's written by a person of color that isn't getting as much attention, right? Like, that's the thing. And that comes where, to me, it comes largely back on the publishing industry and what we're promoting and putting in front of people.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. And it's interesting because this is a female white, she's a female white author of adult fantasy, and female adult fantasy authors, as we know, aren't getting published or as promoted as maybe male authors. So I don't know. It's a tricky subject. I still love the book and will still promote it, but at the same time, you're right. It's good to find examples of own voices too. But I still think that there's something to be said for authors who are willing to engage in that. So, like, for example, the book you talked about, Mary, if I watched, like, for example, I watched, I think Criminali, who's a male reviewer on BookTube. I know he talked about that book recently. And I know he's obviously never going to go through menopause. And the person wasn't written by, it was written by a male. But I think it still said something to me that he read and appreciated that book. Like, I still think that there's room for that. So I guess it's tricky. That's a tricky area. But in general, I want people to feel comfortable writing from different perspectives. I think it only can be a positive thing. Like you said, Jack, I think we still need to be conscious that we're still allowing room in the space for people who are own voices. But I think it can only be a positive thing too, if we're promoting people being able to write from different perspectives.
100%. It's like acting. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, like acting.
I can't think of another entertaining book about menopause. The fact that that's out in the world, and Johanna, you were just talking about someone else that read it. That's cool. And I think, Alan, you said something like that. It gets the perspective out there. Who cares who writes it, as long as a well-done perspective is out there.
Arm of the Sphinx, book 2 in the Books of Babel by Josiah Bancroft, another man. When I read it, I had never seen a fantasy book have a character experiencing menopause before, ever. And I commented on in my review, because I felt like I've never seen this. And it was so well done. I'm like, she doesn't understand why her body feels this way, because she's a very uneducated character that has been, she's on the journey now, which is awesome. But she's such a good character, and she's like, I don't know why I'm having these feelings, and we eventually figure out oh, she's having menopause, and it's so good, it's so good, and I've never seen that before. And so that's another book that has menopause in it.
I don't know, I appreciate it. I mean, I guess speaking as a female, I appreciate it when I see male authors take the time to write really nuanced female perspectives.
Yes.
That means a lot to me. That's something that I loved about Malazan. There were several female characters in which I paused and thought, Erickson, how do you know what it's like to be a woman? How do you know what these feelings are like? It's just, I find that so important to me.
Have you seen the movie As Good as It Gets with Jack Nicholson?
Yeah.
What you just said reminded me of, he's a male, he writes pulpy romance novels or whatever, and has sold a bunch, and a fan comes up to him and says, "How do you write women so well?" And his response is very mean. But when just reminds me of that, he says, "I think of a man, and then I take away reason and accountability." And she's just like, and he just walks away. I mean, the whole point of the movie is that he is an insufferable jerk. He has like mad OCD and like complete like antisocial, hates everyone. He's a misanthrope. But anyway, just the way you said it reminded me of that movie. I don't.
That would be crazy. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I clicked on that because
that's okay.
Spinster meaning, what was that, like middle-aged lady with no husband?
It's 26.
Yeah.
I saw one of the Mistborn era too. She's like, I'm 26 years old and I'm a spinster, and I'm like,
I haven't gotten to era 2 yet, so.
And that's the other thing that drives me crazy is how you know, if you're 30 years old in a fantasy book, you're basically over the hill.
You're dead.
As a female. Yeah.
Well, you're a dead mom, basically. That you're the non-existent dead mom in fantasy, and then that's basically your kid.
Yeah, that's why we just finished reading the Risen Kingdoms trilogies, and in the second book, like we were again, it was rare enough to comment on it. 3 of the like main secondary tier of characters are grandmothers, like they are awesome. Like one runs the spy network, one is like the king's main consort, and the other one does something else. They're awesome. They are so cool, and they are in their 50s or above. And you know, they're ladies, and it's awesome because.
Wait, what is this book called again? I need it in my life.
Oh, it's the second book of Risen Kingdom. That one's called A Labyrinth of Scions and Sorcery, but the first one is An Alchemy of Mask and Mirrors.
Oh yes, that's okay. That's a series you're reading right now, right?
Yeah. We just finished it last month. Yeah.
Oh, you finished it. Okay.
Yeah, but the second one has like. It's got like like there's a group of like, you know, older ladies who are also like they have their own little like spy unit. It's awesome. And they're really cool because you just don't see that a lot, like older female characters.
So I have to shout out the Long Price Quartet, you know, because Anita's not here to shout that out in the comments about the female characters, because I know she always goes on and on about the female characters. But that was something that impressed me in that particular series that I just finished. It's 4 short books. They're
so good.
And it's amazing the way the characters age, because there's 15-year gaps between each of the stories.
Oh, interesting.
And so you follow these characters from when they're teenagers to when they're older. And he actually portrays females, especially in old age, as still being sexually desirable. And I thought that was such a win for me, like to read about that. I was like, wow. Yeah. Because he writes them in a way that I think realistic. Like he even talks about like she started to have jowls and like fine lines. He talks about little things like that, or drooped shoulders, whatever it is. But then he still shows an intimacy with characters. The characters of an old age can still find that spark. I thought that's not really the focus of the book, but it's in there, and I really appreciated that.
But it also has like teenage girl. Like it has some teenage girls that are insufferable because they act like teenage girls, just like teenage boys. But then they appear later, and it's just like, wow, like this is like the natural maturity of human beings. Like
that's awesome.
Like half of my students, like, oh my gosh, like just stop, guys, like just stop being teenagers, you know. And then they become, you know,
and then they become really cool adults, a lot of them, and you're like, when did that happen?
Yes, they stop being larvae. And, you know, are actually people and not like.
Well, it'll be interesting how it happens, because I mean, we all know that reading has become a lot more popular with TikTok, right? And the TikTok audience is largely younger people, Gen right? Z, so book talk, you know, the books are talking about the characters, and these are usually younger. So it'll be interesting how the TikTok generation, the book talk generation ages, if we'll see the characters in books age as well. So I think of Amina Al-Sarafi was a release about she's over the age of 40. She's still powerful. She's still violent, strategic. She still is sexual and has desire. And that was such a cool read for me. But I was talking to someone who is a lot younger, and they didn't like it as much because they can't relate to it. I can relate to like my knees cracking, my back hurting, like, you know, not being as good as I was in my 20s. Not that I'm ancient now by any means, in my mid 30s, but it'll be interesting to see as the book talk generation gets older, what they gravitate towards, and therefore what publishing puts out.
That's a really interesting question. And that's such a good point too, because a lot of people think that whatever social media they get into, they're like, they always think it's their generation and it's the young people. And then it's always going to transform. So like Facebook did that. Now I feel like I see more older people in Facebook nowadays than younger people.
When I was a teacher, my students told me that Facebook was an old people app, and this was 5 years ago. I was like, what? When did that happen?
Not like we're on MySpace. Come on now.
They still tell me Facebook's for old people.
Yeah, that was 100%. At the time, Instagram was the only thing, and Snapchat. Those were the two. But it was before TikTok came around.
I hate Facebook. I hate it with a passion. Like I'm never on there, but I specifically hate it because I love my mother-in-law, but she posts pictures of me all the time and I don't know her friends. She has like this huge community of people and friends. And so I'll go to a funeral or I'll go to some event where I see all her friends and they're like, hi, Joanna. Hi, Joanna. Hi, Joanna. I'm like, who are you? And they're like, they expect me to know who they are because they're on Facebook. And I'm like, I don't know who you are. It's just so weird. It makes me so creeped out. That people know who I am and I don't know who they are, like in person. Yeah.
My students are always like, Ms. Walker, get a TikTok. I say, absolutely not. Absolutely.
No.
My students tried to do the same thing for me, and I was like, no. We're good with no one having that. So
yeah, like, I have to use Facebook. I hate it. I hate Facebook.
I don't sit around thinking about what musical track would narrate this particular portion of my life. And it's weird to me that they do. Like, how do you find the specific music thing that goes with the thing that you're doing? I don't know.
Taylor Swift. The answer is always Taylor Swift.
Oh, look, I like T-Swizzle as much as the next guy, but like, it's got to stop. Ms. Walker, I just spent $30,000 on pit seats at Taylor Swift. I'm going to be gone for the next 2 weeks. Can I retake the test?
Wait, can you backtrack here a little bit? Did you say you like what did you call her?
T-Swizzle.
T-Swizzle? I didn't even know about that.
She's a fan of my channel. You know, we're friends. She's a fan of the channel.
Oh.
Her and Carrie Underwood, I believe, are the.
Her and Carrie Underwood are big fans.
Right, big fans.
I didn't. Okay, no, I like you every day.
I liked Taylor Swift before she was cool. That's a true story.
Oh, I think my husband did too.
I'm not certain I've listened to anything beyond her country albums.
Yeah,
when I tapered out too, I was like, okay.
Look, Teardrops on My Guitar is a banger.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. All right. So I guess I need to come up with another question now. I did have a question because I've been thinking about this topic for a while. I usually like to bring up topics that I'm thinking about in general just in these discussions. Do you all prefer fantasy stories that are more intimately character driven, or do you like fantasy stories that are more about like a bigger theme of the world? Like I know Alan, for example, loves war and he loves themes about justice. But how do you two feel about fantasy stories that go towards these bigger, broader themes versus these more like the hero's journey, for example? That would be more of an intimate character exploration. Do you all have a preference when it comes to those things?
I prefer character. That tends to be more where I fall into it, but it really depends, I feel, on the author and the story. I get kind of subjective with it, but like this year, for example, I started rereading Wheel of Time and started the Stormlight Archive, and I have major issues with both because I feel that the characters aren't well executed. So, but then I read something like First Law where people complain that there's not much plot going on, and I'm like, it's perfect. Like I love the characters so much that it's perfect. So it really, I feel it can vary, but I tend to be more character driven than overall plot driven.
Okay. Interesting. Thanks. What about you, Jack?
I don't know. I mean, I kind of need a balance of both. One of the other reasons I was really hesitant to get into fantasy books is I felt like the plot was very copy paste. This is before I started reading it, so nobody answered me. But I felt like it was like I have magical abilities, you have magical abilities, now we're going to have a war. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, it's the same across everything. And so for me, I thought the plot would be the same, just the magic is different, right? And so that's the preconceived notion. And so I think it was really, when I started getting into it, the depth of the characters really gripped me and made me realize, like, hey, there's a lot more to this. And the characters, even if the plot is that same formula, the characters are what distinguish the books, and make it a lot different. And of course, the plots are different. But so I don't know. I think they're both important, but I would lean probably more towards the characters, which shocks the hell out of me, because when I started my reading journey as an adult, I was like thrillers only. And that's because of the plot, because I wanted plot twists. There's not a lot of character depth with thrillers. A lot of times it's, how unique can you make the plot? How much can you catch people off guard? So I've really evolved as a reader, partially because of fantasy, because it was that character depth that stood out to me.
Well, so many genres I feel like are formulaic in that way.
Oh yeah.
Where they're kind of similar things. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yep.
That's fascinating.
How about you, Joanna and Alan? Where do you fall in the character or plot realm?
So, I mean, I grew up reading Dungeons and Dragons books and playing JRPGs, which is anime in video game form. So I have always been a fan of the large, like, world scale conflicts, but just because, like, my favorite stories are always the ones where you strip, like, it looks like it's impossible, you strip everything away from the characters, and then they win anyway. Like that, like I love that. Like when I played D&D, that was always my favorite thing. But I've also realized that as someone who's played D&D forever, is I always like the early. If you guys haven't played D&D,
I love it.
I've always liked early levels, because at the early levels, the characters cannot do anything. They suck. They have no powers. And so, like, this one bandit guy with his 4 goons poses such a greater risk than later on in the game, where the world is at stake and they can mow through. It's called power creep. And I don't like power creep in books. And I don't like power creep in anime. So part of the reason that I enjoy a lot of the earlier arcs of anime, for example, like One Piece, is because you have to keep upping the stakes, because you can't keep the stakes where they were, because the characters are so much more powerful than they were the last time. And I think that's a problem with fantasy books that do that. So it's certainly a problem with anime. It's certainly a problem with JRPGs. And I like that less, because there's nothing, like, you don't have to be afraid. Like, of course they're not going to lose. Like they could snap their fingers. Like the Marvel movies have that problem now. The Marvel movies, I don't think, have ever really figured it out. No. They certainly haven't figured it out post Thanos. Is like, why on earth do I care? Like, they're so powerful. We got to make up a reason that Captain Marvel's not here, because if she was, like, this would be over. Like, that's the problem with comic books and stuff. And so I do think I like the smaller, more intimate problems, because, like, a personal issue can have the same stakes, like emotional stakes, that we've got to save the world now. A well done, how are we going to save the world plot? I'm probably going to, like, put down what I'm doing and be like, oh, how are we going to do it? Yeah, they've got nothing. Suck it, heroes. And then, but most of the time, I think I prefer I don't like the power creep, because it's not as engaging. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that is where I have landed in my older age.
No, I like this. I like this exploration, because the reason I've been thinking about this a lot is because I just finished Long Price Quartet. So you're kind of perfect to be in this discussion, Alan, because I was thinking about how I think it falls into high fantasy, but maybe not quite epic fantasy, and and it might be more like small scale, or if it was considered epic fantasy by any standard, it would be more small scale epic fantasy, because we're not dealing with such a large scale of the world. We're dealing with two empires, but but really the themes in the story are focused on intimate character themes of friendship, for example, and betrayal and trust and self-loathing. And I would say a lot of those themes, they really delve deep into intimate character portrayals. So it feels like a very intimate character study, even though there are high stakes things that happen. There's incredible, I love the magic in that world. And even the magic itself, I feel like could almost be a metaphor human of the human psyche. So I feel like so much of it is very deeply a deep character, intimate character study. Or, but at the same time, it's a really brilliant high fantasy story. So I don't know. I guess that's why I was thinking about that topic a lot. But I feel like I run the whole spectrum. I can think of stories that are very, very character driven. Like even First Law, I always say that I didn't think I was a super character driven reader until I read Before They Are Hanged, book 2 in the First Law trilogy. That was the first time I ever thought, wow. I'm not saying there's not a plot, there is a plot, but just saying that I realized I didn't care because I was just enjoying the characters and the moments they were having so much that I wasn't thinking about the end goal, if that makes sense, or where we were going. So I love character driven stories, and I loved The Long Price Quartet, as Alan knows. And I would say that's a very intimate, it felt like an intimate story in a sort of high fantasy setting. But then I also love things like Dune, and Dune is epic in every way. I mean, it's more, I know people would consider it more science fiction or sci fantasy, but it's epic. We're dealing with the universe at large. The stakes are so high. We're dealing with ecology. We're dealing with a lot of heavier, like broader themes, themes of leadership and not trusting leaders. And, there's so many things like that. And the characters could be described, especially by modern day standards. The characters in that series could definitely be described as rather flat. Yet I still connected to them. And I still think that, as Philip always says, there's a place for a flat character that they could serve a role in a story. So I actually feel like I run the spectrum. I love stories that are more intimate. I would say Farseer, somebody, I think, yeah, Shadia said Robin Hobb, Reed Hobb, Alan, yeah. So I would say that's similar. It's high fantasy, but I feel like the explorations, at least in Farseer, what I've read so far, are very intimately driven as far as like the character explorations, the themes. I feel like the themes deal more with the character. It's the deep, intimate exploration with the character. Now, all themes I think are probably explored through characters, even broader themes, but still, I think there's a difference. Yeah.
I think it's so interesting too that you can take that ideology and you can apply it to different genres. Like as we're sitting here, this was very fortuitous, but my Augustus book was on the table.
Oh, I love that book.
And it's such an example of if you could do character versus plot. Like you could have that story and make it very plot driven and make it this grand thing where we're going to focus on Philippi and Actium, and that's the story because it's plot. But instead, Williams decides, no, it's 100% character, and that's what makes this story. So it's so interesting that you can take things like where there's empires and things like that, and you can look at it from the very large scope and say, are we going to make this an imperial story? Is it more that, or is it more narrowed down and character specific? And it can go so vastly different with the approach that you take for the same story type thing.
Oh, I love Augustus. Yes. I keep thinking about it. I just keep thinking about that book. I kind of want to reread it. I'm rereading Stoner right now. I'm listening to the Stoner audiobook again, and I'm loving it so much. Alan, I just finished reading the dissertation chapter or listening to the dissertation chapter. And so I'm like, now I want to go. And I'm seeing, what was that?
Mr. Stoner.
Mr. Stoner. And he has a PhD. Shouldn't he be called Dr. Stoner? How
he
insulting.
Should, yeah.
How insulting. But anyway, yeah, I keep seeing parallel themes. I still feel like I still see parallel themes between the two books, even though they're totally different in narrative structure, style. Augustus is much more formal in style and prose than Stoner is, but still with John Williams' very clear, distinct style. So I don't know. What a brilliant book. But that's a great point, Laura. It's funny because I don't think about those events and I don't feel like I know them. I don't know my my history like you and Alan. So I I don't even think about those events really at all when I think about that book, but I do think about the characters and the character explorations there.
Laura, I realized we were supposed to talk about Augustus.
We sure were, Alan.
You have to ping me. I cannot remember who has spoken to me.
Okay, I will message you after this, and we will schedule an Augustus chat. Joanna, you're welcome to come too.
Sure.
You must ping me, because I literally forgot until I saw you hold up Augustus. I'm like, wasn't I supposed to talk to
Yes.
Yeah, I literally just looked it up.
It's a brilliant. I'll probably re-listen to it if we do that. Well, thank you so much. That is so kind of you. Thank you for the.
I have task forgetfulness. I have an awesome memory for memorizing facts, and I have task. I'm like Leonard Shelby from Memento. Like, I have to take a Polaroid.
Are you covered in marker as well?
Remember Sammy Jankis. That's all I gotta say.
Can we have a Memento watching party? I think that would
Memento
be
is such
that would be great. It's a great film.
Jack, I'm sorry. I want to bring you back in the conversation because I know you haven't read Augustus.
Sorry.
No. I'm enjoying listening.
Okay. I think you would like Augustus, actually, Jack, because I know you love classic books. And even though Augustus isn't, I don't know, some people might be able to call it a modern classic. I think you would love, especially in the second half, like the character of Julia.
She's amazing.
It's so good. But I would like to ask you about classics too, while we're on the topic. While I'm transitioning to that, because you read a lot of classics on your channel too, and that's another area where I feel like I have a lot of holes in my reading. I have a lot of holes in my reading in general, but especially when it comes to classics. And so I would love to hear your journey with that. How did you fall in love with classic literature? Is this something that bled over from your early days in your education?
No, I don't think so. I don't like being forced to read something, right? Like, you want to read it, everybody wants to, right? So I don't think it came over from school. I just think I am so easily influenced. Like, I'm every marketer's dream. So, you know what? One of my favorite books of all time is The Count of Monte Cristo. And so that inspires me to find, chase more favorites that are like that. But I read War and Peace, and what made me want to read it is because it's so commonly described as the best book ever written. So, like, I kind of take the attitude of, well, we'll see about that. Like, I kind of want to know. And I love conversations about reading. And I love classics because they've been around for so long. They have such a reputation that more people have read them. So you can relate to more people in talking about them. And then you see threads of these stories in others. So there's inspiration that you read these books that are being published today, and you can see how they took inspiration from other stories. So I think that's really interesting. Rebecca, Mensch, that's one of my favorites.
I'm reading that with Andrew's Wizardly Reads in January.
Best atmospheric read ever. I love it.
I didn't trash Rebecca on Goodreads. I love Rebecca. Mitch.
That's actually the reason Andrew and I are reading it, because you did that wonderful Rebecca review.
I love Rebecca. What? Mitch, I like Rebecca.
I don't know if Alan's ever been more offended than he is right now.
That's amazing, though, Jack. So I haven't read War and Peace. They're different authors. I always get them, I always want to put them together, even though they're different authors.
Dostoevsky and Tolstoy.
Tolstoy. Yeah. I haven't read either of those books.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Great Expectations, I read that this year, and it shocked me with just the tone of it, that I wasn't expecting this darkness of it. And it kind of makes me think of Rebecca, because I felt that way. It's like, they're both such atmospheric reads. The plot of Rebecca is okay, but it's like that. It's just the most atmospheric thing I've read. It's so good. So I really love classics. The list is never ending of all the ones I want to read. So
same here. And Frankenstein is definitely a favorite, and one that I definitely need to reread at some point.
Made me cry. That made me so sad.
It's amazing.
It's a good book.
Yeah, it's so much different than it's portrayed in the media, for sure.
Yeah.
So much more emotional, for sure.
Pretentious.
Yeah, Crime and Punishment is the one I want to read, though. That one actually, that's one of my mother's favorite books of all time. and I love talking to her about books. So I think it would be, I'm pretentious, yay. Well, my mother, I love my mother, but I jokingly call her a prose snob. So I'd love to talk with her about the prose in that book. She knows how to talk about prose, which is amazing. But Laura, you studied classics, is that right? Or
I did, yeah. I've got my master's in it.
Oh, what's your favorite classic then? I know that's such a tough question, but
so classics for my area of study is ancient Rome. Like that's what we refer to as classics. So whenever people refer to like classics as books, I'm like, what are we talking about here?
they're not talking about Suetonius.
No, they're not.
I've read the Odyssey though. I have that.
Yeah.
Joanna, the Odyssey is Greece.
It is Greece. Yeah.
Well,
It's embarrassing. I'm just kidding.
My ears picked up when you said that, Laura.
I don't have any ego when it comes to this because I just don't know anything.
No, I mean, I love the Odyssey. Rome of all ancient, I love Egypt. Ancient Egypt was what got me into ancient history specifically. I wrote my master's thesis on an Egyptian goddess, but in an Italian setting. So I really love Egypt. But in terms of the actual like history of it, Rome is my nitty gritty. But I prefer Greek works of literature to Roman works of literature.
That is because all of the Roman works of literature are just reworked Greek works.
Exactly, because they're copies.
Because the Romans were a very serious military.
Except Catullus.
They're the STEM kids. Like the Romans were the STEM kids. It's the Greeks who were the humanities majors.
Yeah.
The Romans like building crap and war.
The Romans kind of looked over at the Greek kids' homework and were like, hey, can I copy that? And that's basically what they did for a lot of stuff. But
y'all stop being girls. Like they thought they were like
pretty much
eminent answers.
But for Roman works, if you ever want something that's really funny, Catullus, is hysterical, in my opinion. I think he's so funny. He writes really...
Catullus, it's nothing but a grief column. Like
it's
Catullus
so funny.
Is the most obscene, inappropriate like poem. And whenever you read Catullus in Latin class, you can't tell them why we're not reading Catullus 16. Because as soon as you tell them that you're not reading Catullus 16, they go look up Catullus 16.
100%.
Which is like, this dude is it's like this random guy calls out some guy
he's a nut job. He's an absolute lunatic, but it's highly enjoyable if you're looking for someone that's completely neurotic.
Catullus.
So,
I'm going to jump in here really quickly because there's a lot of talk about the new Iliad translation by Emily Wilson. Does anybody know about this?
She just had an Odyssey one, didn't she? She is the new prose translation. And it's the first translation of the Odyssey and the Iliad just came out by a woman, and it's really good. Like the prose is really good. If you like poetry, you should go with Fagles because I love the way Fagles writes.
I love Fagles' translation too. It's great.
I just want to shout out really quickly that one of my next guests on Why Read is going to be iWizard. And iWizard, actually, I was looking on his channel last night, and he has an interview with Emily Wilson. And he has a video on gender and being the first woman to translate.
That's awesome. Because the Iliad and the Odyssey have been crying out for a decent prose translation.
Yes, very much so.
Like the Fitzgerald, which is like the go-to one, it's
not great.
No, like it is. I am hoping that the Wilson translation will get more people to read it because it is inaccessible. Like the Fitzgerald, I don't think the Fitzgerald is accessible at all, as are any of the other.
They're all pretty dry.
I love Fagles. Some people cannot stand the way Fagles writes it.
I don't know why that is. I like it a lot.
I like it too. But anyway,
this is a very niche topic right now. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I just want to go to my bookshelf and see what translations I have. So.
I know. I just have I don't know. Yeah, I don't know anything.
But if you are interested in reading those, I would definitely say, yes, go check out her new one, especially if prose is something that you really value. because the language itself, when you look at the original, is so beautiful. And so much of that gets lost, as it does with any translation for the most part, especially when it's poetry, because I think a lot of the time we forget that it is poetry. But they're great. So I have a very soft spot in my heart for the Odyssey more so than the Iliad. The catalog of ships gets real old in the Iliad pretty quickly, but saying no.
Get out of here. The list of ships is amazing. First of all.
Oh my gosh.
First came the Boeotian units, led by Laertes and Peneleus. Arcesilaus, Bartholomew, and Clonius shared command of the armed men who lived in Hyria. Rocky Aulus, the dancing wings of Mycalessus.
Long. It's that, but for what feels like an eternity. So, yeah.
So what Laura's saying,
just to connect it all to fantasy, though, I know, Alan, didn't you say that there was some connection between the Iliad and Malazan? And then Stephen Erickson got all excited that you said that?
I mean, the Greek epic, just in general, the way like their emotions are big, and it's like it's just very Greek epic. A lot of especially Crippled God, I noticed it most there. Sorry,
that's okay. I'll have to read it. I'll have to read it and then talk to you guys about it.
The Aeneid is much better. I hate the Aeneid in English. Even Fagles can't save it. But the Aeneid in Latin
is terrible in English.
The Aeneid in Latin is so good. I love the Aeneid in Latin. When my kids and I were reading it, like, when I teach it in AP, the kids love it in Latin also. It's such a snooze fest in English.
In English, it's so boring. You just want to gouge your eyes out. You're like, why are we still
But
here?
Virgil's language in Latin is really, really good. I like it in Latin.
Wow. Well, you all, it's going to be about 4:00 now, my time. And I know we talked about capping this around that time. So I just want to see if anybody has any closing thoughts, anything they wanted to share, last final thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This was a good chat. This went totally off topic from what I was thinking.
So
like
directions.
I have like the books that got me into reading right here, but we talked about some great like in-depth stuff of like who has the right to tell a story and translations and women authors and fantasy. This was a great chat.
Women translators even. Yeah. Amazing. What 2 books did you have though? Just really quickly, if you want to show us.
Oh yeah, no, I had Goosebumps and Animorphs from my 4th grade. Because I had more stickers on my chart for books read, and then the thriller Last Mrs. Parrish, which kicked off my adult reading love. Because I mentioned I was big into thrillers, and domestic thrillers are not really my thing anymore because very formulaic, but that one blew my mind at the time and was my gateway book into reading as an adult.
Jack, did you win a personal pan pizza from Pizza Hut with your
all the time. They got
I love those. Yes,
yeah.
we talked about those recently. And do you all remember there used to be those like Scholastic? I don't know if you're all too young for this or not.
Oh, no.
I was
Scholastic
magazines
so much.
where you could like choose what books you want, and then a week later they would come to you, and it would be so exciting. Like, oh, the books I ordered are here.
Yep.
And now we have Amazon Prime.
Hey, guess what? Scholastic magazine has just been banned in Florida schools because there is no way to preview, aka vet, what will be in Scholastic magazine. I literally got an email about it yesterday. Schools can no longer order Scholastic magazine. I loved Scholastic magazine, and then you had because you could also order the books, but it also had like articles. And stuff. Nope. Yeah. We cannot vet them before they arrive in the classroom. Therefore, they are no longer allowed in the classroom.
I just cannot even imagine like teaching in Florida. I just can't imagine that chaos there.
No one knows what I teach.
That was strict.
There is no way like that if anybody was paying attention, they would let me teach what I teach. I teach the freaking Greeks. Like, are you kidding me? Like there's so much objectionable content, quote unquote, in the Greeks and the Romans, but nobody cares. I'm just like, and Alex and Hephaestion had a thing, and and he says, oh well, I guess I will have to be shorter by 1 kiss because I'm not going to kiss you on the mouth, my boyfriend, because you made me mad. Like, are you kidding me? But whatever. I'm happy that I get to teach what I want to teach because no one cares. So
yay.
Yeah.
Well,
Greek symposium.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to everyone in the chat who participated today. We love your comments. And even if I wasn't able to get to every single one, I really appreciate you you chiming in. We appreciate everything you had to say and being here. And I want to thank my guests, all returning guests this time, but I hope to be in future live shows also with you all again. So Laura from Fantasy Awash, a really great channel, has fantastic, actually has some really fantastic video essays that I recommend everybody check out, and just wonderful content in general. And then Jack from Jack in the Book Stack, also a fantastic channel, reads across the genres, has fantastic spoiler-free vlogs, which I think is an art form in and of itself. Honestly, I'm so impressed with it. I'm so impressed with how you go about that. I figured it was so funny because I brought you two together thinking, well, they both read and loved Tress in the Emerald Sea. They both just recently read First Law. They both have enjoyed Mistborn. So I was like, there are some points of connection here, but I didn't even expect the way that things would unfold. And then, of course, we love Alan coming into the chat as well. So thank you all so much. Appreciated having you here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you. And thanks again. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.